From the time of the inception of human cultures and civilizations, we are transmitting some particular kind of themes and stories which try to cast off light on our past, a past which holds the truth about our origins. These popular stories are known as creation myths, and they have almost been around here for the past thousands of years. For a very long time, they have been believed to be true by most of us, if not all. This belief is deeply rooted in the presence of a force which is responsible for this creation of humans, and this force is supposed to be outside of the realm of the reality, something which is unnatural, something which cannot be sensed through the help of our five senses. But things did not remain the same until Darwin did not came into the picture with his idea of evolution by natural selection, which completely topples our perception and shows us the true face of nature and how its mechanisms work. Charles Robert Downey, an English naturalist born on 12th of the February 1809, is hands down one of the most influential figures in all of the science. It is due to his efforts that we have able to decode our past in the most accurate way possible, which is backed up by evidences and science, and not based on any kind of fantasy. His works impacted academia and science so much so that new branches started to appearing after late 18th and early 19th century, such as genetics and evolutionary psychology. But it is the history which takes the sharpest turn due to his path-breaking work. Before him, we do not have any idea or any model to decode our past in scientific way. We have to rely on vague explanations that are not backed up by conclusive evidences but based on hazy myths. Evolution provides us the eyes to see beyond these hazy myths and sets the stage for us to investigate our past for the first time, a past which is of 7 million years of evolution of human beings. Before Darwin, academia was dominated by a certain belief known as natural theology, a philosophical position according to which the very existence of well-adapted organisms and their intricate features cannot be just mere coincidence but imply of a conscious designer who designed them. One such philosopher was William Paley, whose arguments become the bedrock of the 18th century natural theology. One of the most famous arguments in history presented by him was his watchmaker's analogy, which goes like this. When we came to inspect the watch, we perceived that its several parts are framed and put together for a purpose. For example, they are so formed and adjust to produce motion, and that motion so regulated as to point out the hour of the day, that if the different parts had been differently shaped from what they are, if a different size from what they are, or placed after any other manner, or in any other order than that in which they are placed, either no motion at all would have been carried out on the machine, or none would have answered the use that is now served by it. Every indication contravenes every manifestation of design which existed in the watch exists in the works of nature also, with the difference on the side of nature of being greater and more, and that in a degree which exceeds all the computation. Surprisingly, Darwin has also raised questions about the design of nature before disposing of it in 1859. He said that how all those exquisite adaptations of one part of the organization to another part and to the condition of life and of one distinct organic being been perfected. We see these beautiful co-adaptations most plainly in the woodpecker and mistletoe, and only a little less plainly in the humblest parasite which clings on the hairs of the quadruped or feathers of a bird, in the structure of the beetle which dive through the water, in the plum seed which is wafted by the gentle breeze. In short, we see these beautiful adaptations everywhere and in every part of the organic world. But for Darwin, it did not imply that God made all of us, but he had his explanation for all of this. Darwin was not the first one to coin the term evolution. Before him, several others have also argued for the same position. And even his grandfather also argued for the existence of evolution. But no one before him can prove the existence of evolution. He was the first one to prove that evolution is in fact a universal fact, and his idea of natural selection is truly a unique gem which changes the course of science forever. After the work of Darwin, it was clear that all the species are developed by the process of evolution, and so humans also. So, without understanding the evolution itself, we cannot understand our past and how history must have begun. So, it is a prerequisite. To understand the ideas of Darwin in brief, we can break the whole work of Darwin into six major components, which are: first, evolution; second, gradualism; third, speciation; fourth, common ancestry; fifth, natural selection; and the last one, the process other than natural selection that can cause evolutionary change. So let's begin. So the first one in it is evolution itself. It simply means that species can undergo genetic changes over time. That is, over many generations, a species can evolve into something quite different, and those differences are based on changes that happens in their DNA, which originates as mutations. For example, humans evolved from a creature that was an ape-like species, known as primates, but they are not identical to the modern apes today. Species evolve, but they do at different rates. For example, whales evolve much faster than the coelacanth, a type of living fossil. The second one in this discussion is gradualism, which means for a significant change to occur in species, which in fact should be a substantial evolutionary change, does not occur in a few generations, but happens after a long period like 100 or even a million of generations. Gradualism depends on the evolution itself and at which pace it occurs. For example, like bacteria can undergo a significant change in a very short period because the pace of their evolution allows them to do that. In fact, when natural selection is strong, as when an animal or plant colonizes a new environment, evolutionary change can be fast. Once species become well adapted to that habitat, evolution often slows down. Next is speciation, which means the evolution of different groups that cannot interbreed together. That is, groups that cannot exchange genes. When common ancestors start splitting into two different populations, of which one is living in another part of the world and the other one is living in a completely different part of the world, which means both are living in different habitats, then over a long time, these differences which happen due to certain types of mutation gradually grow larger. Eventually, the two populations evolved so much so with a sufficient genetic differences that members of the different populations could not interbreed with each other. For example, members of different animals no longer find each other attractive as their mates, or if they do mate with each other, offspring could be unproductive. Now it brings me to the next point, which is common ancestry. It had observed that two species which are closely related closely each other in terms of DNA sequences, or some features are closely related on an anatomical level. Anatomically means simply shape of their body structure. Always have a common ancestor, a point from where the two species become distinct from each other due to several reasons which we have talked earlier. Until about 30 years ago, biologists used visible features like anatomy and mode of reproduction to reconstruct this ancestry of living species. This was based on the reasonable assumption that organisms with similar features have similar genes, and thus they are more likely to be closely related. But now we have a powerful tool, an independent way of establishing ancestry, which is DNA sequencing. We can look directly at the genes themselves by sequencing the DNA of various species and measuring how similar these sequences are, so we can reconstruct their evolutionary relationships. This is done by making the entirely reasonable assumption that species having more similar DNA are closely related, that is, their common ancestors lived more recently. These molecular methods have not produced much change in the pre-DNA era tree of life that scientists have concluded. Both the visible traits of organisms and their DNA sequences usually give the same information about the evolutionary relationships. The idea of common ancestry leads naturally to powerful and testable predictions about evolution. If we see that birds and reptile groups together based on their features and DNA sequences, we can predict that we should find a common ancestor of birds and reptiles in the fossil records, and such predictions have been fulfilled, giving some of the strongest evidences of the universal fact of evolution. Now this brings me to the second last point of my explanation of ideas of Darwin, and which is the most important idea that was given by the Darwin itself, which is the idea of natural selection. The idea of natural selection is not hard to grasp. If individuals within a species differ genetically from one another, and some of those differences affect an individual's ability to survive and reproduce in its environment, then the next generation with the so-called good genes that leads to the higher survival and reproduction will have relatively more copies than the not so-called genes. Over time, the population will gradually become more and more suited to its environment as helpful mutations arises and spread through the population, while deleterious ones are wiped out. Ultimately, this process produces organisms that are well adapted to their habitats and to a particular way of life. So to sum up this, I will say that natural selection does not yield perfection, but only improvements over time what came before. It produces the fitter, not the fittest. Now I came to the last point, which is the processes other than natural selection that can cause evolutionary change. In it, the most important thing is a simple random change. The random changes in the proportion of the genes caused by the fact that different families have different number of offsprings. This leads to a evolutionary change that, being random, has nothing to do with adaptation. The influence of this process on important evolutionary change through is probably minor, because it does not have the modeling power of natural selection, and natural selection is the only process that can produce an adaptation. These are the 6 principles on which Darwin's evolution through natural selection works. Some of them are interconnected, like common ancestry and speciation, and some are not, like they are independent. For example, evolution, which can take place but did not need to happen gradually. This question is very important because in past it happened many times that popular figures have got the idea of evolution in the wrong way, or if they interpreted the evolution in the wrong way to gain something out of it, which can be political as well. For example, Ronald Reagan, addressing an evangelical group in Texas in 1980, characterized evolution this way. Listen.
Well, it is a theory. It is a scientific theory only, and it has in the recent year been a challenge in the world of science and is not yet believed in the scientific community to be as infallible as it once was believed.